once any paint or gloss on your backdrop is dry, you can start working on actually assembling the different pieces you've chosen and gluing or pasting them onto that backdrop. It's always a good idea to first check that those objects fit well where you want to glue them. So once they're glued down, they're hard to modify. They're very easy to modify when they're just separate. As you can see, I've chosen pieces of cardboard and some magazine pieces. There's this ceramic tile that I've chosen as the sun, and I've had those compiled and ready to go. I just had to figure out where I wanted them placed on the backdrop before I just started putting them wherever. This step may take a little bit of problem solving just to make sure things fit well. If they don't, try to adjust them or find a different object so that way your project turns out how you want it to. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to trace around the outside edge of these little mountains and hills I've made because I know where I want them, but I have to glue them down in different layers. The magazine pieces will have to go first, and then the cardboard pieces on top of that. So it's tricky to see the pencil lines. You do have to press pretty hard. What I'm going to do before I start this is I'm going to use an X-Acto knife. You'll notice X-Acto knives are super sharp, obviously. When you're cutting with them, hold them at a 45-degree angle instead of straight up and down. And when you cut with an X-Acto knife, you have to repeat your cut multiple times. The goal isn't to just use brute force, it's to use repeated cuts to get it to work. I'm using my X-Acto knife to cut through the top layer of my cardboard because I want to expose the corrugated or wavy part so I can have more texture. When I'm using my X-Acto knife, I'm always making sure my hand is not in the way of the blade. I'm making sure the sharp part of the blade is facing the cardboard. And I'm repeating my cuts multiple times because the first time it's not going to cut all the way through. And if you're pressing too hard, the blade may break or fall out, or it can slip and cut you. Now, I'm going to start peeling up this layer. And the top layer has all of that glue and gloss and newspaper, so it's going to take a couple layers to peel up. But once I start to peel through it, you'll notice that the wavy or corrugated part starts to be exposed. It takes a little bit of time to peel off all of those cardboard scraps or flakes, so be patient, take your time. It's important with mixed media to pay attention to layers. So I chose to do this first because this is one of the first layers. If I had glued something else on top of this, it would have been incredibly difficult to carve out this space. So since I marked out where the end of my hill was, I could take all of those objects off, cut the cardboard, and then start adding my layers. I'm going to check to see that it fits pretty well. Okay, so that looks pretty good. If it didn't look good, I could go back in and adjust it a little bit, cut a little bit further, or add something to it if it didn't look quite right, but I like how it looks, so we're going to leave it. I'm going to assemble everything back together and make sure it's all looking good before I start gluing it down. Alright, so now as I'm going to start compiling these objects, I need to figure out what types of glue are actually going to work well for this project. The X-Acto knife has to be put back on the teacher's desk, that's where you're going to find them, so make sure you put that back first. But there are different types of glue. It's obviously normal Elmer's glue. This works well for lightweight things, papers. There's also Weld Bond, which looks like Elmer's glue, but it's really great at adhering things that are a little bit tougher to stick down, like pieces of metal or bolts. There's also hot glue. So the hot glue works well on objects that are a little more three-dimensional, but are a little more porous. So for example, if I tried to glue down a sheet of metal with the hot glue gun, it would probably fall off. Now, each of my different objects will probably need a different type of glue. You most likely will not use gloss unless the stuff you're gluing down is super flat, like newspaper or magazine pages. Technically, I could use gloss for these magazine pieces, but I'm going to use Elmer's glue. When I put Elmer's glue on here, I'm not going to use a ton, and I like to spread it out with my finger a little bit so there's not a bunch of globs. And when I place it down, I want to make sure all of the edges actually stick. Since this is one of my first layers, if they peel up, it's going to cause problems for all the layers on top of it. You can also put glue directly on the backdrop, smooth it around with your finger, and then add the pieces on top of that. For the cardboard pieces, I'm going to use hot glue. The hot glue is located in the hot glue gun drawer in the front of the room. If you need to add an extra glue stick, those are also in that drawer, and you simply place them into the slot and just keep using the hot glue gun. Hot glue guns are hot, obviously, and you do have to work quickly with them because the glue dries as it cools. So in order to get things to stick, you have to make sure the glue is still hot when you apply your object. The hot glue guns should remain on the front counter. You shouldn't be taking them all over the room. So if you need them, take your object up there, glue it down, and then take it back to your spot. It should not take a long time, especially because your object should be ready to be glued in place. You shouldn't be changing it or cutting it or adding to it as you're gluing it down. This sun is actually a ceramic piece. The top part has glaze on it, so it's shiny. The back part is just raw clay. So hot glue would work on the back part of this, but it may not work super well on the shiny part. I might have to use Weld Bond so it would actually stay put. I'm going to use hot glue since I'm gluing the raw ceramic piece, which is porous, to my project because I want the shiny side to be showing. I'm going to press this on there pretty well since it's a heavier piece and make sure it actually stays where it's supposed to. Now, I've been digging through these boxes and finding different objects that I may want to use. There's tons of different stuff up here. You just have to be creative in the ways that you use it. Your goal is to have at least 4 different types of media, so you do have to be creative about the stuff that you use. It's never a bad idea to test a few things out before you decide on one. Since there's such a wide variety of objects, if you just glue the first things down that you find, you may find other things you like better in a different box or further in the box. I'm going to take this piece of burlap cloth and sort of glue it to this front hill. So I'm going to roughly trace around that hill so I can cut out this burlap. When I put this down, I'm noticing it's not quite the right shape, even if I sort of spread it out, move it around, so I'll probably have to adjust that a little bit. I want the texture of the burlap to be showing a little, so I'm gonna tear some of these top pieces off. Be creative with the different textures you can find. Pretty much anything will work in mixed media. You just have to be creative enough to figure out where you can put it and how it's going to work with your theme. I'm going to use hot glue to put this burlap down, which is a little scary because the burlap has a bunch of small holes in it, and if I'm not careful, the hot glue can squeeze through those and burn me. Hot glue is hot, obviously. So as I'm placing this down, I'm being really careful and just tapping lightly to get the burlap to stay where it's supposed to. You can also use normal Elmer's glue, it just takes a lot longer to dry. Now, any other objects you choose to use, for example, I might use some of this white fiber for some clouds in the sky to add a little bit more texture. You have to be mindful of what type of glue works best for the object you happen to be gluing down. Now, hot glue would work for these pretty well, but I would also have to be careful, just like when I was gluing down the burlap pieces. If you get to the end of the hour and you still need to clean up and you haven't glued everything down, you may have compiled some objects you like and you know you want to add and you don't want to put back in a box. So what you can do is you can take a scrap sheet of paper, just computer paper or whatever, and create a little folder. You can either staple or tape the sides. And you can put any objects you want to include into this folder so that way they don't get put back in the box where anyone can use them. Write your name on these, they're all going to look pretty similar. And either store them in your sketchbook or you can store them with your project, just laying on top of your project. At the end of the hour, you can store this on the drying rack if it fits well, or you can store it in the vertical storage, which is in the computer lab. You can ask Aya if you need help finding that, but please make sure you clean up really well.